Okay, here is the other half of the Renaissance and early modern lecture because YouTube made me cut it in half. We talked about classicism, we talked about Neoplatonism, we talked about like the important historical developments, humanism. So, thinking back to that medieval world where there was one viewpoint, one truth, for the most part, one religion, and very kind of little individuality. In the Renaissance, there's more value to the individual's opinion, an awareness that there may not be one right answer or way. Galileo's trial, right, illustrates the battle between that medieval worldview and the new one. And by the time, right, we get through the 18th century, we'll be firmly into a world of scientific empirical inquiry that values reason as opposed to faith. But at this period, we're seeing that ordinary life is more accepted as a focus of art and that secular works are read and studied instead of only sacred ones. So, more of a focus on human beings in everyday life. And just to draw some comparisons here, this is a painting of Madonna and Child on a curved throne from the medieval period, and you can see how, first of all, there's no perspective. The people seem very flat. And if you look at baby Jesus, he doesn't look like a baby. He looks kind of like a tiny adult because this isn't meant to be realistic. And that adulthood is meant to show his power and knowledge. And so he doesn't look like a baby. Um, this is a very kind of different way of thinking about art. Here we have Raphael's Madonna of the Meadows. Again, a representation of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. And in this case, it's like his friend, St. John the Baptist. Like John the Baptist and Jesus are just having a little play date here. And she's dressed in some ways very similarly. Like she has a red dress, she has her blue as well. But these are, in addition to the beautiful perspective and just beautiful depiction of the human body, these seem like human everyday people. Even though it's a religious focus, these are everyday people. They look like people you might know, and it humanizes these subjects. We talked about government, having political power centralized at court instead of kind of more disparate, like barons or important provincial aristocrats. And again, so in 1399, King Richard II is deposed and assassinated by the orders of Henry Bolingbroke, who will be Henry IV. And the kingship, the executive, just gets more power. The king has more economic and political power. Again, I mentioned the Wars of the Roses earlier. Um, this will end with more consolidation of power in the monarch. I know there's a lot to write down here. Again, you don't have to write down every word, but what I want you to note, okay, in that, right, like end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, so like 1485 to 1588, this will be basically 100 years of struggle between competing imperial nations: France, Spain, the Netherlands, and England. And that 100 years will end with England being firmly on top in terms of power and hegemony. Right. In 1534, Henry VIII declares himself the head of a Protestant English church, and he brings England into the Protestant Reformation. Now, it's not like a firm deal because his daughter Mary is a Catholic and marries Philip II of Spain, and she takes England back to being Catholic. But then when she dies without an heir, Elizabeth is a Protestant. She takes England back to being Protestant. This will culminate in a very important battle in 1588 when England destroys the Spanish Armada. This is important because this leaves England with an unquestioned naval supremacy for basically over 100 years. And that'll be really important to establishing an empire and colonies. There really won't be any threats to foreign threats to English sovereignty until we're in the 19th century with Napoleon. So that defeat of the Spanish Armada is really important. Just a couple notes, just to remember, like we have discoveries of like the Newfoundland fishery, George's Banks, and like English possession of land and claims in North America. And right, we begin the colonization of North America in the 1620s. So, beginning of empire. Remember, I talked about literacy and class mobility. Well, books, and specifically these books called conduct books, could enable anybody who could read to acquire the manners and appearance of nobles. These are like kind of like the first self-help books. Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, so it's published in English in 1561. It taught you how to acquire those skills that you would have before only gotten by being at court. So you could advance yourself by reading, by education. You could create yourself through education. This is what we will call self-fashioning. So we can see that classical humanist education really opens up opportunities for people who could read. So we're talking probably middle class people. This also opens up the concept of the Renaissance man. And the Renaissance man was kind of good at everything. He was good at using weapons like a sword, like he could fence or do archery. He was physically agile. He was a good tennis player. Tennis is actually very popular. Henry VIII is a really good tennis player. You would be a good tennis player. You would be a good hunter. You could swim. You would speak and write well. You would know Latin and Greek. You could write poetry. You could play music. You could draw. And you would do all of these things easily and gracefully, what they call sprezzatura. And we can think of kind of two different historical figures really illustrating that Renaissance man. And one is Henry VIII. He, before his accident where he hurt his leg and then he kind of got like really fat, like he's famous for being really fat, but that was only later in his life. He was physically agile. He was a good tennis player. He did know, he was incredibly well educated and knew Latin and Greek and wrote poetry and played music and was interested in the arts. Another person that we might think of like this, and this is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man illustration, probably the most famous illustration in Western art, would be Leonardo da Vinci, right? He not only painted things like the Mona Lisa or did this important drawing, he invented machines and he was interested in science and engineering. And he also, he wasn't a noble. He grew up lower class to middle class and was educated and became educated and was interested in all these various things. And he also is kind of this stereotypical Renaissance man. Speaking of writing poetry, so when we start to see this in literary forms, what kind of literature do we see formally? We still have the epic poem, and we will be reading a Renaissance epic poem. We have new innovations in poetic meter, We'll talk about iambic pentameter. We'll talk about with Shakespeare. We'll talk about blank verse when we get to Milton. The lyric, and those are a lot of the poems that you have first. Short, personal, emotional poems. Not epic poems of heroes and monsters and stuff. Sonnets and the sonnet sequences and the sonnet lecture will go into that. And we have more drama, right? We saw Everyman, which was a morality play, a very religious play. We'll see comedies, we'll see tragedies, we'll talk about what is a mask. We'll see lots of different drama. And we move right from to having theaters. Those medieval mystery plays, those were traveling troops that would go around and put on their play. We'll start to have theaters. So a lot of the poets we'll read kind of break down into these various eras. So we'll start with the court poets, 16th century poets, Wyatt, Sidney, Surrey, and Spenser, and those are a lot of the poets that you have for next time. They're writing during the time of Henry VIII. In fact, Wyatt will be imprisoned by Henry VIII. He is suspected of committing adultery with Anne Boleyn. Surrey will lose his head by Henry VIII. He's kind of the last victim of Henry VIII. We'll see 16th century poets like Shakespeare, Marlowe, Raleigh, I can never pronounce it, and Johnson, Cavalier poets, metaphysical poets, and we'll get into more of like what are all those kind of poets later. Theatricality. So again, humanist translations of Greek and Roman plays. We have a more focus on secular and popular theater, right? Instead of basically Bible stories, we get comedies about everyday human life and tragedies. Sometimes things that are about the government of the state, like what does it mean to be a good king? What do you do when your kingdom is corrupt? And we get semi-permanent theaters. So that's very important. Lyric poetry. Okay. Poetry is also becoming more private, more secular, and popular. Again, poetry is not really published. Instead, your manuscript would be circulated among a group of friends at court, and sometimes written for a patron. Like a patron would pay you to write a bunch of poems for, in most cases, him. In the first lecture, I mentioned Petrarch, and we will see Petrarchanism. So in the Renaissance, poetry is something that all courtiers were expected to be proficient at. Being a poet was not perceived as a job because you didn't really get paid for the poetry. It was more like poetry showed that you were good at writing and persuading people, and that meant like an aristocrat should make you his secretary, or you would get a political job. Petrarch lives in Italy. He's one of the first writers of the Renaissance, and his sonnets, they do rely on a lot of courtly love conventions, but they go a little bit beyond it, and it kind of combines Neoplatonism with a lot of those ideals of courtly love. And like we'll see Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, they translate Petrarch's poems into English, and they make this kind of poetry more popular in English. Now, some elements of Petrarchanism are, okay, you address a lady, you praise each part of her in this kind of list that's called a blazon. Love, like courtly love, it doesn't feel good. Like it's like you burn, you freeze, you're kind of tormented. Um, the lady might be cold, or maybe she doesn't love the speaker, and this is almost always contrasted with her beautiful exterior. But her beauty and goodness is going to lead the poet to like the beautiful and the good. It'll be a kind of Neoplatonic ideal. And I'm going to go through this very quickly because I'm running out of time. This is Spenser's sonnet, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want you to notice this part at the end about like her eyes are like sapphires, her lips are like rubies. This is that blazon where you get that list. So think about this for the poems for next time. Did it not say?